Welcome to another episode of My Counselor Live. My name is Matthew, and I'm so excited to be joined today with one of our clinicians. On today's episode, we're going to talk about something that's very important, and you don't want to miss our discussion. Joining me is one of our clinicians here at MyCounselor.Online, Emily Hurst. Emily, would you just introduce yourself to our listening and viewing audience today?
Yeah, I'm Emily Hurst, one of the clinicians here at MyCounselor.Online, and I am located in our Denver office. So that's kind of where I operate out of, but I see clients all over the US and all over the world.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about an article that you just wrote about, and the article is called Grief, It's Never the Same. Um, I could probably think of a million reasons why you wrote this article, but um, tell us from your heart, like what inspired you to write this article?
Yeah, I had a lot of clients come in all at the same time, kind of. They were all new clients where grief was the presenting issue, something that they were wanting to work through and process. I remember in school, my supervisor actually told me, whatever you're going through in your life, you're going to notice that you're going to get a lot of clients at the same thing. So I had actually been working through my own grief, just things that had happened and people I had lost. And then I had a lot of clients coming in with their grief and just realizing how many myths there are about grief, how much misconception there is about grief, and how misunderstood grief is. And as I sat with people and just hearing some of their questions and what they were wrestling with, I realized that there was not a lot of information out there, that the things that we're taught or that we hear are really they're harmful and they're hurtful, and they make it really difficult for people to grieve in a healthy way. And so I decided to write this article, one, just to help understand my own grieving process, and then two, as a way to just have people have a space where they can come and kind of start to debunk some of those myths or get some answers to questions, and just have it be a starting place for understanding their own grieving process.
Yeah, that's good. So, and you kind of already touched on this, but who is this article written for?
It's written for everyone. It's written for those that are grieving. And also, I think people who have someone in their life who is grieving could really learn a lot from this article too, because so much of the hurt that comes from those grieving moments is the things that people say, the well-meaning things that people say, but they don't realize that they're actually really hurtful. And so I think both parties could learn a lot from this article.
Yeah, I want to get into some of those well-meaning things that people say. We'll get into that a little later,
Yeah.
because I've heard those things so many times, and but we'll get to that in just a second. I want to talk about some things that you wrote in your article about how there actually aren't stages of grief. Wow, can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest myths that there is out there about grief.
Yeah.
And that's funny because even when I was like in my undergrad studies and I took a grief counseling class and we learned about the stages of grief. But as I was sitting with my clients and then just doing more research, I started realizing that those stages were created, but then they've been kind of given to everyone for grief, and that's not true. So essentially, those stages of grief were created to conceptualize someone who was more grieving the future they won't have. So like someone who's given a terminal diagnosis. So say a client goes to their doctor and their doctor tells them like, hey, you have cancer and you have about a year. That's when the stages of grief might apply, right? They're going to deny that this is a thing. They might start bargaining with God that, hey, if I give my life to you, if I do this, if I do that, if I donate to charity, will you heal me? So those are the stages of grief, and they apply to those kind of situations. But then what happened is people started thinking that they applied to people who have lost someone. And so I would hear clients come in and be like, I'm in this stage of grief, and kind of getting confused because they're like, why haven't I reached this stage of grief? Or I feel like I'm repeating this stage of grief. And so there's just all this kind of confusion around it. So yeah, essentially the stages of grief are more for the people that are grieving like a diagnosis, because if you think about it, right, so the stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so when we tell people their stages, they think they have to go through all of them. They'll experience all of them. But if you have someone whose grandma was 95 and had lived a really good life and was really struggling with like Alzheimer's and passed away, chances are that client is grieving their grandma, but isn't bargaining with God about it and isn't in denial about it, and might not even be angry about it because they almost feel like, okay, there's a sense of relief of like the suffering is over. But then they feel like they have to move all through. So that's kind of debunking that myth of there's not stages. It's going to look different. You can't put your box in the fact of like there are 5 things that you're going to move through and then that's grief, because that's just not the truth.
Yeah, I've seen grief work its way through many different factors. In the article, you talk about the timetable for walking through grief and if healing is possible. So, what kind of insight can you give to those who are asking how long their grief will last?
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the hardest questions to ask.
Yeah.
Grief isn't linear, so it's going to look different. It's going to play out different. You're going to bounce back and forth between things. There'll be seasons that are harder than other seasons. And so the answer I kind of give people is there really isn't a timeline that you can put yourself on. Right? Each person is going to grieve so differently, and each person might, one person might grieve for like 6 months and then feel like they've really entered into this space of kind of like healing, and another person, it might take years. Some people, they don't have the space to grieve when they have that initial loss, and so then the grief might hit them 3 years later. So there really isn't a timeline that we can put people on. And I think that's the question I hear all the time is, how long am I going to hurt? How long is it going to be before I don't cry when I think about them, or when I don't do this, or when Christmas isn't going to be hard? And there's just not an answer for that. People say grief takes time, and yes, that is true, but also recognizing like sometimes, it's just it hurts, and that's okay that it hurts. And I think with people, when they think about time, it's how can I get over my grief? And it's not so much about getting over it as much as it's about learning to live with that space that is no longer filled. And
Yeah.
If that makes sense at all. It's not a concrete answer. And I think people always want like okay, we'll work for 6 months and then you'll be good. And that's just not the fact, because the other thing that plays into that is grief is complex. It compounds on each other. So if you have someone who comes in and they lost a parent when they were 15, but they weren't able to grieve that parent because of life circumstance, and then 10 years later, they lose someone else in their life. Now they're grieving both situations. Yeah. So grief becomes complex and compounded. And so that could also impact the timeline.
Yeah, it just seems like there's nothing absolute about grief. It just seems so fluid in how it moves from person to person.
Yeah, and that is so true. There's nothing absolute about grief. We can't say like this person's grieving poorly or this person's grieving wrong, because grief just looks so different, both in how it's going to manifest and then in how long it'll take for a person to move through it. And I think in my article, I give the example that 3 sisters could lose their mom, and each 3 will grieve differently because the relationship was different. And so that is absolutely truth, and that grief is fluid. There's no concrete thing that we can say like this is what is going to happen and you can expect from it.
Yeah. So what if I'm trying to help somebody through grief, and you touch a lot on this? What's some things that are helpful, and then what are some of those things that aren't helpful, like the things we say, like they're in a better place, an angel's got its wings? You can list like 100 things that people say, and tell us why those things aren't helpful. Yeah,
so one of my favorite resources for grief, and it's something that I quote a lot in the article, is the Grief Recovery Handbook. And in the very first chapter, one of their quotes is, grief isn't about a broken mind, it's about a broken heart. And what's wrong with those comments is they're very cognitive. They're factual. And so while yes, it's true, the person's no longer in pain. And yes, it's true that they're in a better place. That doesn't touch the heart. It's a cognitive statement. And the person likely already knows that. They already have that knowledge, but their heart is broken. So when we say those things, we're completely bypassing the emotional experience. We're not honoring the fact that this person is hurting. And so things that you can do is just sit with them. If they want to cry, sit with them in their tears. If they want to be angry, allow them to be angry and know that that's not unhealthy. If they want to laugh, even if it makes you uncomfortable, let them laugh. Let them feel what they need to feel, and just sit with them and tell them that you're there with them. Tell them that you want to sit with them in this experience, that you want to hold space for them. Because I think so many people become uncomfortable with grief. They're uncomfortable with tears. They don't know what to say, so then they don't say anything at all. And in reality, the biggest thing you can give to a person is just to listen.
Yeah, it's presence over words, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you know, speak directly to somebody who's either grieving, and also to the person who knows someone who's grieving. What maybe is a final piece of advice you can give to those two specific audiences?
I think for both of them, the biggest piece of advice I can give is just be gracious. Be gracious with the people in your life that are grieving, and knowing that, you know, they might have things that are going on that you don't understand, and they might behave in a way that you don't understand, or they might, you know, start feeling things that you don't know what to do with. And just be patient and be gracious, be attentive to that. And for the people that are grieving, again, be gracious with yourself. It's okay to be angry at someone that has passed. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to experience joy. It's okay to want to yell. It's okay to want to cry. It's okay if you want to feel like you want to throw something. It's okay to have good days, and it's certainly okay to have bad days. And so just that understanding of this is your process, and it's a hard process. And so just being patient with yourself in that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. You know, at one point, we're all going to experience grief. It's something that we're not going to be immune to in life. So, man, if you're listening or watching today, and you know someone who's going through this, man, this article is very encouraging, and really, I love the freedom that's kind of presented. Like, give yourself some grace. It's okay to grieve. Be angry. The emotions are fine, right? That's why God gave us emotions. So thank you so much, Emily, for writing it. Again, you can check out the article in the show notes below. So one thing that we like to do is we like to talk about trending topics. And today, our trending topic is reparenting yourself. I love going through trending topics because we get to hear from a clinician's perspective. And so, Emily, would you just walk us through and tell us what is reparenting?
Yeah, so in its simplest form and definition, reparenting is giving yourself something that you didn't get as a kid. So it's providing that child self in you, the love, the compassion, the ability to express your emotions, the permission to set boundaries, things that maybe your kid self, your child self didn't receive. And so the adult self is going to provide that for them. And so, yeah, reparenting is essentially, it's done a lot in therapy, oftentimes not even intentionally. It's just the therapist, you know, responding to anger with patience and grace. It's teaching the client that, you know, it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to feel emotions. This is how you identify your emotions, because you didn't learn that from your parents. So yeah, if there's like one simple phrase, it's just caring for your child self and giving your child self what you didn't get.
Yeah, that's helpful. So how does someone start reparenting themselves?
Yeah, so like I said, reparenting comes from recognizing the needs that weren't met as a kid and
Mm-hmm.
as a child. And so the biggest starting point is identifying your needs. Do you need help with setting boundaries? Do you need help with identifying your emotions? Do you need help with regulating your emotions? Do you need help tearing down really negative self-talk and narratives that you have about yourself because of the environment you were raised in? So identifying your needs is going to be the biggest first step in doing that. And then from there, helping address those needs and giving yourself those things, or going into therapy and allowing the therapist to walk you through that.
Yeah, that's good. So it seems like there's a lot of benefits to reparenting. Are there any dangers?
Danger is such a strong word. I think there are things to be
Right.
careful
Yeah.
of. Right? When we start doing this kind of work, it can reveal other things that maybe we had been unaware of. And so be willing to know, like, when you start this type of work and when you start reparenting yourself, whether outside of therapy or in therapy, there's a good chance other things will resurface. You'll start noticing other deficits that occurred, or start remembering other memories from your childhood where you're like, oh, like, this is maybe why I do this as an adult. This is why I struggled with this as an adult. Recognizing that a lot of emotion might come up, right? A lot of anger and frustration
Mm-hmm.
at your childhood, a lot of grief at the childhood that you didn't get to have. So just being aware that whenever you start something like this, or whenever you start even therapy in general, things come up, which is really
Mm-hmm.
good and it's healthy because it means we can address them, but it can also be overwhelming and it can be emotional. And so just being aware of that is going to be a really big thing when people start this process, which is why, doing it with a therapist is so helpful, because the therapist can help care for you and regulate you.
Mm-hmm.
The therapist can help, see things that maybe you wouldn't be able to see, having that third party perspective. So doing it in therapy is really, really helpful. But, obviously people reparent themselves every day outside of therapy too, when they change a pattern that was developed because of their childhood.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. Thank you, Emily. So we're going to transition into our Q&A portion of our episode, and we have some questions that were previously submitted. Before we get into them, I just want to encourage anyone listening or watching, please submit your questions to us. We love answering questions, and we keep whomever is asking the question, we keep that private, and we will not reveal any names. So you can ask your questions just by simply going to MyCounselor.Online/ask. And who knows, we'll probably answer them in future episodes. So, Emily, our first question for you today is: my husband has ASD. I'm struggling with what's intentional and cruel in his behavior towards me, and what is the ASD. He doesn't understand how his ASD affects me.
Okay. So I'm
Hmm.
assuming ASD in this situation is standing for autism spectrum disorder. And so just recognizing first that that's a really interesting dynamic. It's a
Mm-hmm.
difficult dynamic, because there are things that are different. There are, interactions and communication barriers that are going to come up because of this diagnosis. And so for the wife, just recognizing, like, yeah, this is hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay that you struggle. And like, I just hear the desire in that to try and understand the pain in that. And so there wasn't really a question in that, but more just recognizing, like, the diagnosis isn't a free pass.
Mm-hmm.
Not a free pass to not be intentional in trying to understand your needs. It's not a free pass in being dismissive. It's not a free pass in taking ownership of the diagnosis and working to understand it and how it impacts himself, how it impacts you, and how it impacts your marriage. It's not a free pass to not work on communication and awareness in himself. And so what I would say is, bringing in a third party, going to therapy might be really helpful, to help both of you understand how this dynamic is happening, because unfortunately there aren't a lot of resources out there for
Mm.
when autism is a dynamic in the marriage. A lot of people can't relate to it. So my guess is this wife probably doesn't have a lot of people in her life who can understand the struggles that she's going through and what this feels like for her to be in this space. And so therapy, I think, would be a big plus just in learning how can we communicate, where are areas that we can grow, how can a third party maybe see dynamics that my husband isn't able to see, or needs help seeing because of his ASD. And so that is kind of just where I would come at with that, is recognizing it is hard, but it's not a free pass for him.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not necessarily a question they submitted, but it sounds like it's just a cry from their heart,
Yeah.
and that's bold. Takes a lot of boldness to do that, and I think you're spot on. Like, it's tough, and that third party can be very valuable to that person. So, well, thank you, Emily. We're going to go on to our next question, and it says this. All these questions are pretty deep. My wife of 13 years cheated on me all of last year. How can I get my wife to show up to our marriage like she did in the affair? Hmm.
Yeah. And I just hear the pain in that question too,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
cry. And so the difficult thing is with that is we can't force anyone to do anything. I have clients come in all the time and like, how can I get my spouse into counseling? It's like, we can't force anyone to come into counseling
Mm-hmm.
because it's not going to be helpful. I've had spouses come into counseling who are forced and given the ultimatum to come in, and they sit there with their arms crossed and they're angry and they're like, I'm just here because they told me I had to be here. And so it's kind of the same with this situations. We can't force anyone to do anything, but I think, obviously the conversation of like the desire in your heart to still have the marriage and to still pursue the relationship. Again, I think therapy is really important to address the wounds that were created in that affair,
Mm-hmm.
to understand how did the affair happen, what happened. Affairs are trauma. That is a
Mm-hmm.
relational trauma that occurred. And so the healing is a journey. It's a process. And so for this person, recognizing we can't force the wife to do anything, unfortunately. As much as
Mm-hmm.
I wish that me working with a client could change the people in their lives, it doesn't. But I think just being honest is a really good place to start, communicating your desire and your longing, communicating your dedication to trying to work through it, and then asking if she would be willing to seek out help from a third party to help understand what happened. Where did this breakdown occur? What allowed this breakdown to occur? And then also just supporting you as the person that's been injured deeply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you, Emily, for sharing that. And man, again, if you have questions, please send them on. You can again go to MyCounselor.Online/ask. Emily, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to today's episode. Your wisdom and insight is very valuable, and I know everyone who's listening or watching has probably got a lot of takeaways from today's episode. So thank you again, Emily, for joining us. Yeah. Well, hey guys, thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much for sending in those questions. Before we go, I want to encourage you to go check out our social media, so that you can get a lot. I mean, there's tons of free resources, especially on our YouTube channel. You can go check us out on Facebook and Instagram. Our handle is very easy. It's just Love My Counselor. And we're all of those resources that are free to you that you can share, and that you can just take in. You can go to our YouTube channel, and our handle there is MyCounselor.Online Christian Counseling. Again, MyCounselor.Online Christian Counseling. Again, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. And again, Emily, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you have a good day and a good week. And we'll see you again next time for another episode of My Counselor Live.